me introduce this second talk by Giuseppe Dico from the Catholic University of the Sacred Heart, Milan, and he wants you to know that there is a copy of his paper, and it's out in, Francesca is distributing the paper. The title of his talk is Introspection, Illusion, and the Methodological Denial of the First-Person Perspective.
Thanks, and good afternoon to all, and thanks for being here to listening to my talk. Okay. First of all, it is better not trust the subject. As a psychologist, I wonder how the epistemological status of my discipline and of cognitive science in general is still a matter of controversy. I think that, at last, the very question on the table is nothing but whether it is a natural or a naturalized science, a social science, or something hybrid between these two ones. I also think that most researchers working in the so-called area known as cognitive science tend to consider themselves as natural scientists. In this sense, they tend to argue that the object of inquiry, the mind and its property, whatever it could mean, is something that is subjectively and of course indirectly observable through intersubjectively validated methods and so on. Such an approach can be called objective or third person. It has certainly allowed psychology and cognitive science to gain a certain number of results and credit. In this sense, such an approach can be defined as fruitful. But the open question here is whether this approach is completely true. That is, whether it tells all the story about the mental and its properties. Personally, but not only personally, I think it does not, and I want to face this problem by discussing a specific issue, that of the place of introspection in psychology and cognitive science. Thus, it is nothing new. I think it's quite old from the origins of psychology, I think. But it is still a matter of debate. I have defined introspection in a very narrow sense, that is, as an empirical method of inquiry to which subjects are able to learn and then verbally report about their own currently going on or their recently past mental states or processes. It is worth noting that even though the term introspection really occurs in recent textbooks of cognitive science, psychology, or research methodology, we can find traces of it under various aliases, such as verbal or introspective or self-reports and so on. As clearly stated more than 60 years ago by the psychology and historian of psychology Boring. I'm sure that those familiar with cognitive scientific literature have no difficulty to say that many experiment or review papers refer to data coming from verbal reports. Psychologists tend to ask many questions to subjects and have verbal reports from them. The point is how researchers consider this data for the justification of their theories, especially in comparison with other kinds of evidence. My personal opinion is that verbal reports have no great credibility among the majority of cognitive scientists and psychologists. For example, let's consider the following quotation from a prominent authority in the field, that is to say, Philip Johnson Laird, a famous cognitive psychologist. It is impossible to establish the veridicality of subjective reports. At worst, they may be fraudulent. At best, they may be misleading because none of us has access to the wellsprings of thought. And there is in the paper another quotation, but I leave it here because it's very similar to the previous one. As I just said, similar statements are quite common in cognitive scientific literature. The statements are formulated as showing a mere and simple empirical fact, then generally accepted by the scientific community, that introspection is a sort of illusion, since people have many mistaken notions about their introspection information and its value. For example, in a long and documented review, the psychology Pornin argues that the introspection illusion can sometimes be a source of danger, since it causes problems. It can foster conflict, discrimination, lapses in ethics, and the barriers to self-knowledge, and the social intimacy, and so on. So it appears a really dangerous such an illusion. She points out that such an illusion has 4 components, with the first being the most characterizing. Introspective waking. When people have to assess themselves, they generally tend to be too confident or overconfident of their introspections. Self-other asymmetry. When people have to assess the others, they generally do not rely upon introspection. Behavioral disregard. People generally tend to disregard observable behavior when they have to assess themselves, and to take it in full consideration when they have to assess others. Differential evaluation. People generally tend to take into great account their own introspections and to underestimate tasks over others. As we can see, Pornin argues that introspection is a potential source of biases and errors, and thus hopeless as a method of scientific inquiry. Thus, as we can see, researchers seem to derive a sort of methodological claim, that of mistrusting verbal reports and methods related to introspection or something similar, from an empirical fact, or better, from a very large body of empirical and experimental evidence. Such a methodological claims implies the preference for non-introspective methods of any sort in psychological research, such as behavioral observation, non-conscious priming, and brain neuroimaging, in order to pursue the goal of understanding mental experience. In other words, only third-person and intersubjectively validated methods are allowed in the understanding of the mind and its properties. Because of the biases and errors that introspection can provoke, researchers cannot trust what experimental subjects tell about their point of view. Second paragraph, the self-other parity account, and at least a bit, not so much, but I don't know, Freudian cognitive science. It is important to stress that for qualifying a method as introspective, it must list, among the others, the so-called first-person condition. On this condition, introspection aims at generating knowledge, judgments, or beliefs about one's own mind, and no one else. Although the knowledge generated through introspection may be a useful basis for knowing other people's minds. This implies that it is postulated an asymmetry between the way we know our own mind and the way we know others' mind. That is to say, people can directly know others' mind through introspection, but they can indirectly know them only by making inferences from the observation of others over behavior. In other words, because of the first-person condition, introspection provides a sort of privileged access to the mind. The owner of their mental states or processes can have a better understanding of them than the others, and thus, at the methodological level, psychologists and cognitive scientists can trust her when they ask about what is going to happen in her mind. However, it is clear that these pictures clashes with empirical facts emphasizing the presence of an introspective illusion. In fact, if we take a look at the 4 components of this illusion above mentioned, it appears to be evident that it is the first-person point of view that leads people to commit evaluation and judgment errors, and thus to make the data coming from introspection scientifically unreliable. Roughly speaking, the 4 components aim at showing that the first-person perspective is so influential subjectivity that can lead to give a reliable interpretation of both inner mental states and outer behavioral phenomena. For this reason, various researchers appear to more or less explicitly endorse a counterintuitive position from the standpoint of common sense, the so-called self-other parity account. This account points out that people can have a reliable and adequate comprehension of their own mind only on the basis of the same processes through which they acquire knowledge of the other's mind, rather than through introspection. Thus, according to the simplest version of the self-other parity account, the first person condition cannot be met. This means that reliable introspection cannot be met in any way, and people can know both their own mental states and thus of others only indirectly, that is, by inferring them from the observable behavior. It is clear that these arguments echo all the criticism moved by the psychologist Watson into introspection, into Wundtian introspectionism. In his manifesto, Psychology as the Behaviorist Views It. However, I think it would be quite unfair to define supporters of the self-other parity account as behaviorist, in spite of the similarities between them. In one of the most important contributions in favor of the self-other parity account, the developmental psychologist Gottlieb strongly rebuts the charge of reproposing a version of the old-fashioned behaviorism. In fact, differently from behaviorists, she stresses that internal psychological states exist, and the discovery of their nature is the main aim of psychology. In this sense, the self-other parity account can be defined as a truly mentalistic approach. She goes further by pointing out that there are also full, rich, first-person psychological experiences of the Jewish or Wolffian kind. However, similarly to behaviorists, she points out that the first-person experiences cannot be considered as the genuine causes of people's thoughts and behaviors. This is because, first, people have internal psychological states, observe the behaviors and the experiences related to, both in themselves and others. Second, they build up theories about the causes of past behavior and experiences that postulate the adoption of a first-person perspective. Further, as a consequence, they experience the first-person perspective. In other words, as we can see, we cannot have a first-person perspective. We have an illusion of it, or how to say, a sort of confabulation about this point of view. This position is very close to that proposed in one of the most cited, maybe the most cited, but I don't know, and controversial papers in psychology, that is to say, Nesbitt and Wilson, 1977, as explicitly claimed by Gottlieb. The crucial argument of Nesbitt and Wilson article can be briefly summarized in these two following points. Many, maybe all, emotions, judgment, thoughts, feelings, and behaviors are caused by an unconscious mind, in Gottlieb terms, the internal psychological states. Because people cannot have any conscious and first-person access to the unconscious mind, the conscious mind confabulates reasons, in Gottlieb terminology, build-up theories, for explaining emotions, judgment, etc. I think that the quotation of Johnson Laird I proposed above follows more or less the same line of reasoning of Gottlieb and Nesbitt and Wilson. Most of our mental life is unconscious, and because verbal reports are not the product of any genuine introspection, but are post hoc theories of confabulation of what is supposed to happen or have happened in the mind, they cannot be considered as reliable tools in psychological and cognitive scientific research. Quite ironically, the self-other parity account above sketched appear to have some similarities with the psychoanalytic framework proposed by Sigmund Freud. Of course, it is not my aim here to propose such a parallel. It's something very difficult, I think. However, at least at a superficial look, both of these approaches share the idea of a human being driven by unconscious mental states, almost completely inaccessible to her consciousness and not controllable by herself. In this sense, I think it should not completely implausible to talk of a Freudian cognitive science, and to assume that mainstream psychology and psychoanalysis share at least a few conceptual issues. But probably I'm a bit wandering. Thus, I'll quickly come back to the methodological and theoretical issues related to the introspection illusion. Third paragraph. Introspection illusion or a measurement problem? Let's see. What amazed me of the literature in favor of a self-appropriated account, and more in general of the idea of an unconscious mind, is the great amount of empirical evidences reported for its justification. In this sense, as I pointed out above, the prevalence of an unconscious mentality over the conscious one appears to be an empirically well-grounded scientific theory. I mean, most of the scientific community in psychology seem to adopt this point. The fact that all our mental states are unconscious or whatever this could mean. That is to say, the claim that our unconscious mental state, inaccessible to introspection and thus to a first-person perspective, play a significant role in the determination of thoughts and behavior, seems to be empirically confirmed and generally accepted by the scientific community. Luckily, or unluckily, depends from the point of view, all the scientific theories can be continually revised and put into question, and psychological and cognitive scientific ones do not accept. Very recently, this year, psychologists Newell and Shanks have proposed a critical review about the role of unconscious mind on decision-making, and have reached rather different conclusions from those of the supporters of the self-appropriate account. The main focus of the review is on the methods used to test whether empirical experimental subjects are conscious or not of the mental processes involved in the determination of behavior during decision-making tasks. They point out that in decision-making tasks, it is generally made a comparison between a behavioral performance, for example, the number of choices from a set of various alternatives, and a conscious assessment based on subjects' verbal reports. Researchers infer that a certain mental state is occurring, or has occurred unconsciously, if subject's behavioral performance is clearly guided by this mental state, but the verbal reports do not reflect it in any way. So researchers tended to look for dissociations between the verbal report of the missed verbal reports and the behavioral performance during a cognitive task. So they can establish if they have conscious access to, they have understood the rule of the task and can express verbally through verbal reports or not. If they don't find reliable verbal reports, they infer that the mentality is the mental process involved in the solving of the task is unconscious. So, according to their proposal, the proposal of Newell and Shanks, in order to be reliable for assessing the presence or the absence of consciousness, a test, a verbal test, must meet 4 criteria. Reliability. The assessment test must be unaffected by task factors that do not influence the behavioral performance, such as, for example, experimental demand or social desirability. Relevance or information. The assessment test must consider only the amount of information relevant to the behavioral performance of the decision in question. Immediacy. The assessment test must occur concurrently or as soon after the behavioral performance as possible to avoid possible lapses or distortions. Sensitivity. The assessment test should occur under optimal retrieval conditions. For example, the same stimuli must be provided both for evaluating consciousness and for eliciting the behavioral performance. It is important to note that although the Newell-Shanks article is very recent, the idea behind the criteria for assessing consciousness dates back to 2 papers written by Shanks himself in the Psychology St. John's more or less 20 years ago, but in another context from decision making. In these papers, Shanks and St. John provide an articulated criticism of what they call the thesis of implicit knowledge and learning, according to which the most of people's knowledge is the primary cause of their behavior, but it cannot be represented into consciousness. Further, also the learning of this knowledge takes place unconsciously, both at the time of learning and at the time of retrieval. According to their criticism, most studies in favor of the basis of implicit knowledge and learning use invalid test of consciousness, that is to say, test clearly violating criteria of relevance, the criteria B, and D, that is sensitivity, of the previous list. For this reason, they conclude that the empirical evidence in favor of the thesis of implicit knowledge and learning is not so grounding and well established as it can appear at first look. In this sense, the Newell and Shanks 2014 article can be seen as an application of Shanks and St. John 1994 and 1997 to the area of decision making, where the thesis of implicit learning, knowledge and learning seems to be prevalent. However, the 2014 papers goes beyond the conclusion reached in 1994 and 1997 papers. In fact, in the older articles, Shanks and St. John aim only to show that the study using the tests of consciousness, the review, violate the relevance and the sensitivity criteria. Instead, in the newer article, Newell and Shanks also show that the study using tests of consciousness that respects the four criteria above described either demonstrate directly that behavior is under conscious control, or can be plausibly explained without recourse to unconscious influences. As we can see, the points moved by Shanks and colleagues seem to overturn the picture sketched by the supporter of the self-proprietary account and overthrowing cognitive science. In fact, at the empirical level, they argue that the data coming from verbal reports, if adequately assessed and treated, cannot be defined as illusory, confabulatory, or misleading in any way, and can be legitimately used for justifying the psychological theories. Instead, at the theoretical level, the mind seems to be, at very least, much more conscious and introspectively accessible to a third-person perspective than we can think, and the appeal to the unconscious in psychological theories does not appear to be always justified. Final paragraph, number 4, concluded, not conclusive at all, remarks. Now it is time to come back to the starting question. Should introspection and the data coming from it be eliminated from psychology and cognitive science? Thus, should the methods of inquiry of psychology and cognitive science be limited only to the third person and objecting subjective, objecting intersubjective ones? And consequently, are psychology and cognitive science natural or naturalized sciences? We saw that Shanks and colleague work cast serious doubts on the supposed unreliability of the data coming from introspection and on the claim that most of the mind is unconscious. I think that their arguments are compelling, and the four criteria they propose should be met in the construction of every test for assessing consciousness. However, it is worth noting that because most studies I review do not meet these four conditions, the question about the consciousness or the unconsciousness of the mind appears to be far from being answered, and only future empirical research could give some more hints on it. I believe that the most relevant conclusion of Shanks and colleagues' work can be summarized in the following way. Researchers should start to take subjects introspective or verbal reports much more seriously than they actually do, and also to try to call some fundamental claims and commonly accepted theories into question. However, for doing it, they should also assume that the subject is able to adopt a first-person perspective, allowing her to access her mental states and processes. Such an assumption seems to clash with the possibility of using only objective, intersubjective, and third-person methods for assessing psychological facts. That is to say, if we take a look along the Newell and Shanks 2014 review, we can find that sometimes the authors must focus upon the sample data obtained from single participants for assessing their degree of consciousness, and not only upon the results of the overall sample of subjects. This is clear, for example, in one of the studies they review, in one of the few ones respecting the four criteria above discussed. That is to say, the Maya and McClellan 2004 paper on the re-examination of the Marshall somatic macro hypothesis, specifically when they discuss the results of two single participants, respectively number 36 and number 41. As we can see, the adoption of the first-person perspective seems to imply the adoption of methods typical of an ethnographic approach. This means that the primary goal of verbal or introspective reports is to provide an accurate characterization or description of one particular person's experiences, no matter whether they can be similar to or different from some or most other people's experiences. Of course, this does not appear to fit very well with an idea of psychology as a natural or naturalized science, aiming at being nomothetic, objective, intersubjective, and based on the average responses of large samples of individuals to the introduction of some experimental manipulation in comparison with a response to certain control conditions. Personally, I don't want to argue that psychology should rebut the nomothetic approach in favor of the ideographic one. I believe that these two approaches should be viewed as the methodological legs of psychology, in spite of their irreconcilable differences and in the historical and philosophical tradition they come from. Thus, in my opinion, the denial of one of these two methodological tenets would lay psychology on the line to be incomplete and thus untenable. In conclusion, I want to stress one point. Although Shanks and colleagues' paper above considers challenge some central claims of psychology and cognitive science, such as the idea of a conscious mind and the rebuttal of introspection as a method of inquiry at the empirical level, I think that the main game should be played at the theoretical level. This means that the assessment of the first-person perspective seems to imply the dismissal of the idea of psychology as a full natural or naturalized science, or at least as a certain branch of natural science, and thus to require a radical reinterpretation of many, if not all, psychological concepts and constructs. In this sense, I think that the main questions are still open, and a lot of work must be done, and that is really exciting.
10 minutes for the discussion. Yeah, Professor Lynne.
Thank you. That's right. Okay. Thank you. That was really quite a very interesting paper. I've just defended my view of the first-person perspective. And one thing I have always noted when talking to psychologists, in fact, I co-taught a course on the first-person perspective with Hilary Cornbluth, who's a cognitive science at UMass, and he is also on the parody thesis. He's really hot on that, like Carruthers, a lot of people are. Anyway, I appreciate the fact that you had some certain reservations. But one question I have just to psychologists in general is, it seems to me that when they talk about the first-person perspective, they have in mind some epistemic faculty, like introspection, and that you can evaluate whether or not you evaluate what somebody thinks in terms of truth and falsity, confabulation, as opposed to, and my idea of the first-person perspective is not primarily epistemic. It's primarily it's a capacity that allows you to do things you couldn't otherwise do, like make a vow, enter a beauty contest. I mean, all kinds of ordinary things requiring you to be able to think of yourself in the first person. So I wonder, what is it about, maybe I'm just missing the point of what psychologists are doing, but they seem to be, as I say, just working along epistemic lines, and whereas I'm working on lines that are not primarily epistemic. So it seems to me that there's not necessarily any possible conflict at all.
I agree with you, but I think that at the theoretical level, there is not such a, how to say, I think in psychology and cognitive science, there are a lot of definitions of first-person perspective. I think that in my paper, I want to stress a methodological point, but methodological as used in psychological research. That is to say, the data coming from a first-person point of view. Personally, but that's my point of view, I think that for first-person perspective is much more than an epistemic faculty or epistemic point of view. But I think that in psychologists have many different opinions about it. It's very confusing. I don't know. I think, however, that to say that probably psychologists tend to refuse this first point of view because they think that they can lead to a sort of dualism. In fact, if you read some research textbooks and so on, tend to refuse the dualism of the Cartesian kind. In general, is much more monistic or physicalistic, and maybe there is.
Alfredo Tomosetta.
Okay. I have not exactly a question, perhaps a remark. I think this thesis, I'm always incredulous. For example, they say we have to use non-introspective methods such as brain mirror imaging. Now, this is a naive point, but they look for neural correlated consciousness, and to do so, they of course rely on subjective reports. They have to trust them.
Yeah. But I agree with you, but the article by the psychologist Poning is published in a very important paper, in a very important scientific, how to say, it's with an eye impact of papers. I cannot agree, but I agree with you about the fact that many methodological or psychological notions in psychology are very naive. I completely agree as a psychologist. And sometimes for me it's very difficult to discuss with my colleagues about something more finer than others. When I read this part, I was very surprised about it, because say, okay, in my opinion, it's much more ideological than empirical.
Michael Pauen.
I have a question regarding the evidence that you referred to, and whether there isn't an important difference in the studies referring to the first-person perspective. One of the most important ones that you refer to, the Lisbeth and Wilson paper, I mean, it's not directly about first-person phenomenology. Most of the examples that they give is about explanations for action. And what they show is that we don't have direct access to the real, or at least in some cases to the real causes or reasons of our action. And that seems to be something completely different from not having access or not having reliable access to first-person phenomenology. And I mean, in the Schwitzgebel papers, and I think that's a really important source, I mean, he also reflects on the difficulties of providing evidence for reliability or non-reliability of first-person perspective reports. And I mean, the only one that I can think of is what he quotes is this the study on dreaming in colors versus dreaming in black and white, where you have the 1940 studies where people report that they're dreaming in black and white, and then you have the same questionnaires from the 1990s, and then people start reporting to dream in colors. So that seems to give some evidence that that there might be some unreliability involved. And the second systematic point that I think is important is to reflect about, I mean, normally you would think that reliability of third-person reports depends on correction, that we reach some kind of agreement by mutual correction of possible errors. That's something that's impossible in the first-person perspective, and of course that we can apply different methods. So we have some tools or some help by scientific methods or by scientific instruments. That's also something that does not apply in the first-person perspective. So that seems to give a systematic difference between the first and the third-person perspective that is to the disadvantage of the first-person perspective. So again, the 2 points of my comment is first a systematic difference between first-person explanations and first-person phenomenology, and then systematic differences between the access that we have or the reliability that we have in the first-person perspective because certain methods are lacking.
Thank you very much. I hope to be able to give a brief response and clear understanding your point. About the review of Nisbet and Wilson, I think that's very, and it is the same for Prony. I think that this explanation about the post-hoc explanation or confabulation that people give during verbal reports, I am not sure if it is so well empirically founded. I mean, my opinion is that they start from their starting point is that most of our cognition is unconscious, works at the unconscious level. And they start with this assumption, and then try to demonstrate that verbal reports are reliable. In fact, in the paper by Nisbet and Wilson, there's a part in which they say, okay, the verbal reports are unreliable not only when they are incorrect. This could be an example of the influence of unconscious cognition, but also when they are correct, because it is a reconstruction of what people think it is happened. But this claim, I think it's very unfalsifiable. How can I falsify that something is wrong when it is correct and vice versa? I think it's logically, it's a bit nonsensical, but of course many psychologists accept it, so I have to accept the truth. So that's but I'm not sure about the validity of people's confabulation. Another point, and here I think I have to close.
There is one more question by Roberto, so if it is up.
No, but the point is very brief, I think. One is, okay, about the falsification of Nisbet and Wilson. Now I lost. I think that probably psychologists aimed at construct a naturalized psychological science. And so to avoid all the disciplines. I'm not sure about it. But thanks.
Can you make
Well, it's a very simple question. Maybe I can.
Okay, oh, sorry, so much. Well, the question is, it's apropos reliable, okay. Does a naturalized psychology supporter trust her own mental states when she is asserting that psychology must be naturalized? And if not, why? And yes, how? Okay, but this was hypothetical with you, so.
Yeah. I think, no, I completely agree. I haven't a response. I think that such a kind of response would be too tranchant in a certain sense.
Why?
I don't know why, but I think that my colleagues, but I think that this is just an hypothesis. It's my personal opinion. I think that they can report a certain idea of natural science. And and another point I think is about the difficulty in dealing with the verbal reports at the methodological level. I mean, I ask to people here, do you think that are scientifically more reliable brain imaging images or verbal reports about what people say, about questions and so on? So, when I was a student in psychology, I was very fascinated about neural images, spiral patterns, and so on. Now that I meet philosophy, not so much.
Okay, thanks a lot, sir.